introduce you to Jamie. She is about to finish up her PhD. She spent some time working in Antarctica, and a lot of the people who follow Waterlogged have expressed huge interest in Antarctica. Tell us a little bit about the research that you've done.
The project that I'm on is actually part of a really large project that started about 50 years ago. I think we're at year 51 now. So yeah, it's a huge ongoing project, and it has really focused on the demographics or the population of this group of weddell seals. So they are confined completely to Antarctica. They're the only marine mammal they're the southernmost breeding marine mammal, and then there are, I think, 3 other marine mammals that are only found in Antarctica. So they're pretty unique in that sense, and so they've made for really good study species in terms of figuring out how do wildlife populations function when we're not there, kind of screwing things up for them. And so a lot of questions have been focused on females because it's easy to understand how females drive the population because they're the ones giving birth. They're generally the ones giving the parental care. So they're usually a far more interesting study subject. And so when I came into the project, the idea was, hey, how do you feel about looking into males? And so I was like, yeah, I'm for it. Let's do it. So my projects have looked at survival in males of weddell seals, and then looking at just kind of a comparative study of how all seal and sea lion species can survive, just focused on the males, and sort of what kinds of other factors might affect their survival. And then the last piece to my work is looking at how the male weddell seals use the habitat, and then kind of how does the abundance of females in there sort of play into how they use that.
Oh, all right. That's very interesting. I didn't realize that there hadn't been that much work done on the males prior to this point. But it's pretty cool that they've been around. Research project has been around for 50 something years, and you're still able to do something new.
I feel really lucky to be part of it. So it's cool. It's been very different from a lot of my previous work.
I've got a list of questions from our followers. And actually, one of the things you mentioned, and I know that you've done a lot of work with exercise, and you said track and field and stuff. So one of the people wrote in talking about a study done in 1982 where they looked at internal body temperature. Yes, I don't know how true this is. You might know better that humans are able to have a 6-degree range and remain functional. Is that true? So,
yeah, pretty much. So my understanding is that if our body temperature reaches about 108 degrees, we're unconscious, we are in a coma, we're still alive at a very basal level, but unless we get medical help immediately, that's kind of our max temperature.
So then again, on the lower end of the spectrum, obviously it's very cold where you're doing research. So the question is, how real is the risk of hypothermia? How did you combat and prepare for the extreme cold?
Yeah, absolutely. Hypothermia is a real risk living down there, and also frostbite and, just general, maybe not quite to the level of hypothermia, but when you're in a very extreme environment like Antarctica, your body is working really hard just to thermoregulate and try to stay warm and maintain some level of, warm enough temperature to stay alive and conscious and able to work. So because of that, we go through a lot of training, and we have issued gear from the government that we have to have with us or on our body. I think it kind of depends on the specific clothing, if we have to have it with us or actually on us. And so that involved, everybody was given a pair of bibs, so kind of similar to what people wear hunting or for construction, basically really thermal snow pants. So we had those, and then we had a very large coat. It's called Big Red. Everybody gets one. and it's kind of the equivalent of wearing a really strong sleeping bag. So they're made of down, um, feathers, and they're super warm. We actually didn't wear them very much. We always had them with us if, you know, things got real extreme and we needed to wait out some weather. But they're bulky, so it was hard to work in. But my setup was, so that's on the outside. We had a smaller jacket that we would wear on the outside. We called it Little Red, just seemed fitting. They're both red in color, so that helps you visualize it. But so that's on the outside. And then under that, immediately under that jacket, I had another jacket. Um, and this was, it's the warmest coat I own. It's actually not mine, it's Patrick's. But for the viewers, my husband's. So he's bigger than me, so it was very warm, and that was also down. And so I had that coat underneath the coat, and then I had another jacket. It was kind of a thin, I don't know the material. It's not down, but kind of a thin, like nice spring or spring or fall jacket for places like Montana. Under that, I had a thermo kind of zip up. They gave us, um, I don't know if they were wool or fleece or something, but those were actually too large for me. I stand at 5 foot nothing, so most of what they gave me was too big. But luckily, I had my own. So a fleece zip up under that, and then under that, I wore a thin wool shirt, and I think that was all the layers on top. And then underneath, I had the bib, or on bottom, I had the bibs, and then can't remember. I think some of the days I wore like a thinner pair of running tights, and then fleece pants on top of those running tights, and then I had two pairs of really thick wool socks on my feet. And then we all are issued, they're called bunny boots. I think they started in the military, but they're just a rubber boot. So it's really good at keeping out any wind and stuff and holding in all of your body heat. And I used hand warmers and I used toe warmers every single day. So that kind of gives you an idea of how well we can dress for that. And then we went through trainings the first week we're there. Every single person, it doesn't matter if you've gone for the past 20 years or if this is your first time going, you have to go through at least some of those trainings every year. So it's to keep us safe. It's to help you keep your team members safe. And so those trainings included things like, what are the signs of hypothermia, the early signs so you can catch it and get people to safety or at least a warmer state of being a little bit quicker. And then same thing for frostbite. What are some early signs? How do you try and guard against both of those things? And what do you do if you start to see somebody with those signs, to try and make that or keep that from getting any worse and hopefully get them feeling better soon. And then just other things like, here's how to survive should your sled break down, your snowmobile break down, and now you can't get anywhere other than on foot. Here's what you need to take with you every time you leave your campsite so that if you're stranded, if there's a whiteout snowstorm and you really can't move, here's how you can stay warm. Here's some food and some extra clothing and blankets, a pop-up tent, and some gas and lighters and stuff to start a fire.
Dang. That seems like a whole lot, but I guess if you are, in that situation, hopefully you never are, but you can be ready. Now,
Right.
so I'm just out of curiosity. So like when you're talking about all these layers, it seems like a lot of bulk. Like how much of what you do, I know you like were taking photos and stuff, like how did that, was that really hard? Like with gloves and all the layers on?
Yeah, it's certainly a trade-off. For a lot of our work, when we're either photographing the seals or putting livestock tags on them, you really need to have good dexterity in your hands. So it would be sort of a dance of putting on these really warm mittens when we're traveling and when we're looking through the colonies. And then as soon as we get to work on a seal, those come off. a thinner pair of gloves come on, but you don't want to keep those on too long, otherwise your hands are going to start to feel terrible. So it was just a lot of glove changing throughout the day. So that worked pretty well. And then just in terms of general bulk, that was a strong trade-off. My very first day out on the ice, which was not with the SEALs, but just kind of a training day. I had not figured out my clothing system very well at all by that point, and I think it was just the most awkward I have ever felt in my life. And we get off, they wrote us out on this little machine that can go through the snow. And so I get off of that. I think I was able to get off on my feet. I don't even remember, but I didn't stay on my feet very long that day. And I looked down and I could barely see my shoes because my coats were puffed out so much. Um, and I was wearing the big red at this time, and it was actually a size too big for me. And I was able to change that afterwards, but um, I was wearing all the issued gear that they gave to me, and it was all too big, and so it was just like all this material that I was trying to sift through just to be able to walk. And so I was terrified after my first day. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna be able to do anything. But then afterwards, I figured out that I could just use my own clothing that actually fit. So that helped. But yeah, it is something to consider that we had to be able to move around. And it's still not as great as, just going out here, where you're not wearing so many layers of clothes. But yeah, there was kind of a nice point where it's like, okay, I am warm enough and I can move good enough.
So now can't remember if we've talked about this or not. Like we're talking about it being like extreme cold. So when during the year were you there doing the research, and what were the average temperatures during the day and night?
Sure. So we get there kind of their late spring turning towards summer. So for us, that's sort of late September, and then we leave around mid-December. So just as their summer is starting to start. And so that means we're in almost constant sunlight, which is really nice. We can see everything and we can work at all times of the day. But when we get there, it's particularly difficult because we're coming out of that summertime and early fall. And so it's generally pretty warm out here. And then we get there and they're just coming out of their winter season. So that's when it's the coldest. Those temperatures could be around 30 below zero Fahrenheit. So they were pretty chilly the first few days we were there. And not every day is that cold, but generally, 20 to 30 below was pretty normal. But then by the time we're leaving, it actually warmed up quite a bit, and it's very usual to be up near 30 above, in the 20s and close to 30 above. So that felt really warm, just relative to where we were coming from.
20 or 30 degrees here, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna freeze to death.
Yeah.
I can't imagine it being negative. All right. When you were doing research in there, you said this project's been going on for quite a while. Why do you feel, or like, I guess the general consensus there, why is doing research there important? You touched on it, I think, a little bit.
It's a really nice opportunity to be able to study in Antarctica because there are no humans living there full time. There's no real human population or society on that continent. And so that means that this is the closest thing we have to what we would call a pristine environment or a pristine ecosystem. Really, we don't have a lot of pollution getting over there. We have a little bit. It's all over the globe, but the lowest concentrations are in Antarctica and just in that bottom of the world area. There is some commercial fishing that occurs in that ecosystem, so it's we're just kind of starting to see some of those effects now, and that's really minimal impact so far. We'll see what that turns into later. So we don't have a whole lot of humans involved in these ecosystems, so we can actually study what would happen naturally. So if you were to compare this to, the medical field, this would be the ability to study a human that has no diseases, no ailments ever. Just this is how a human is supposed to live. Here's our baseline. And so we can use that with, here's how a mammalian population functions. It has no threats. It's doing really well. It's large. The growth is generally positive, but not, crazy. And there aren't really outside threats. So it's a lot of information to use for kind of these basic questions rather than what we would call applied science. I'm not sure how familiar your viewers are with those terms, but basically we are looking at questions mostly thinking about, how at a fundamental level do these organisms, do these ecosystems function versus here's a very specific study, um, very specific impacts on a population.
Okay, that makes sense. Is there a research station there year round?
Yes. Yes. So we work out of McMurdo Station. That is for the United States. And then there are a few more pretty close by that area. It's on Ross Island, which is technically not on the continent of Antarctica, but it's, associated with Antarctica. And so we have people who will work there year round. It the population in the wintertime gets really low. I think it falls under 100. So when we get there, there's usually about 200 people living on site. And then at peak times, that can go up to about 1,000 people from the US living there. And then, very low numbers over the winter just because it's hard to get a lot of work done there. And then I don't remember what the actual number is, but the ratio of support staff to scientists is really, really high for a ton of support for the science that we do. So that's awesome. But yeah, so we function out of McMurdo Station, and then our group actually gets to set up a campsite, which is basically shipping containers that we've outfitted for living. And then that's within our habitat. So it's about 12 miles from the station.
Okay, very interesting. Great. So I know a lot of times with marine mammals, um, there's a very special permitting process that goes along, and I noticed all of your pictures have like a permit number. Obviously, again, you were doing it with a group that was kind of already established, but what was the permitting process like?
Sure. Yeah, so as you kind of mentioned, I wasn't directly involved in this permit, but I have written permits for other studies, and we conduct what's called level A harassment, which means you're actually touching the animals, which you have to do in order to put tags on them. So that one is a little bit harder to obtain. It all goes through, well, they're kind of split with our governmental organizations, but they go through either NOAA or NIMS. And so you basically apply for your permit and you just outline your study, why you would need to do this, how it's going to be helpful, and they'll get back to you. They're pretty quick about it. I think when I applied for a level A permit, we had no experience ever touching marine mammals. So, but we had experience studying them. So I think that one took us about 6 months to finally get, and that included a lot of feedback with, oh, we're not so sure about your method. Let's try and fix this. So with this one, when they renew them, I imagine it's a very quick process, kind of, hey, we're going to continue what we've been doing. But yeah, you do have to have a permit so that you can go in and do this research because it is illegal in our country to basically it's called harassment even though you're not intending to hurt the animal. You can't go up to marine mammals.
Yeah, that's actually I've done a post some stating kind of that you can't do this, and like even like just taking pictures,
Mm-hmm.
especially getting so close, and like that's cool that there are those protections set in
Yeah.
place. Um, So you mentioned talking about tagging. Um, I have one of the followers wants to know, how do you go about tagging a seal?
Yeah.
And then how do you track them after they're tagged?
Okay. Yeah. So our tags are really boring. They're just livestock tags. They're either rubber or plastic, depending on the year that we use them. And it just has an identification number on it. They're like this big, so they're pretty small. And we put them on the rear flippers of the seals. So kind of well, it's not a tail because I guess they do have a tail, but in the back. And they have sort of digits, kind of like we do. And so if you can imagine my hand being the flipper, we would put them on the outside um, of the flipper, right in between their bones. And so it's a much thinner area. There's not so much muscle, and it's mostly just skin and a little bit of fur that we're going through, almost like getting your ears pierced. And so we use, it's kind of a specialized plier where we can put each side of the tag into it, and they have a sharp end and sort of a receiving end. And so you squeeze the pliers and they just sort of fit together. Again, very similar to getting your ears pierced. And so we do this in teams of either 2 or 3. That way, one person can kind of keep an eye on the other seals in the vicinity, because they are 1,000-pound carnivores. They're not, they're not terrible threat, but they're not, um, you know, uh, super gentle all the time either. So one person's looking out, the other 2 people, or one person, depending on the group, is doing the tagging. And the way we track them is just by going up to the seals and looking at the identification number. And so we have a database with all of those numbers. And every now and then we do have to retag them. So that's associated with just sort of a master number, even if their rubberized tag number changes. And then, so we just keep track by seeing, okay, seal 1, 2, 3, 4 was here on November 10th of 2020. Um, and then you can look back and see all the times that we've seen seal number 1, 2, 3, 4. Other groups down there will place radio tags on the seals where they can actually track where they're swimming. And so that's more informative, but that's not what we do.
Like, I imagine that it would be a little bit more expensive to have tracking gear on there that actually is going to be able to withstand the elements.
Right. So our goal with our project is every year seals are born, we try and tag every single pup that is born into the study area. So ideally, all of the seals have tags on them and we know how old they are. We do get immigrants every year, so we don't have all of them, but that's what we do. And then these other groups will target maybe 5 to 10 seals to learn something about their swim behavior.
Now, so how big is the population overall that's down there?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's not one that I can fully answer because I have really narrowed in so much on what I do. But over the past, I think, probably 35 to 40 years, we've tagged over 24,000 animals as a group. Now, not all of those animals are living at once. Um, and I don't think we really have a good idea of the full abundance of the population, just because it hasn't really been a strong focus of our group. But in in a single year, we'll usually find, well, years are kind of variable, but anywhere from about 1,000 animals to maybe close to 2,000 animals will be in our study area. And this is who's coming into the breeding grounds. And so they're spending the rest of the year elsewhere. So we don't know how representative of the population it is. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea.
You mentioned that they're not always there, that they do dive and they spend a lot of time foraging.
Mhm.
Can you talk about the physiological behavior behind their dives and like maybe like how long can they hold their breath? I don't know if you know this or not.
Sure. Yeah, I can't tell you a ton because it's not my total focus, but as any trying to be good scientist, I do know a bit about my species. So they can, we do know that they can hold their breaths for upwards of an hour. Whale seals are one of the seal species that actually can hold their breaths for the longest, but most of the recorded dives are actually under 20 minutes. And they get better as they get older, which is sort of reflected in their diet too. So the younger seals, maybe in the first year or two of their lives, they're not very good at diving yet. Their systems aren't fully developed. And so they're making shallower dives. And they're not able to get as big of fish doing that. And a lot of times they're eating crustaceans, just anything that they can actually capture, they're going to eat. The adult seals are going after, um, they eat a lot of silverfish, is their main staple. And then if they can, they'll get an Antarctic toothfish, which is a really large fish and really slow growing fish, but full of fat. So high nutrient, high caloric intake for them. But they are larger and so they're better swimmers. So they don't get those as often. And really, it's more of the older adults that can actually capture those. But they can dive pretty deeply. A lot of dives are a couple 100 feet in depth. So yeah.
All right, very cool. That's I guess I guess when you think about it, it kind of makes sense that the younger guys aren't able to do as much and thus would not catch as much. One of the questions: true seals are normally solitary. Does living there in Antarctica change that?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot of um, social behavior that we observe with them. The way they space themselves, they're kind of in close quarters. So we don't catch them in the later part of the season where they're done reproducing, they're done with the breeding season, and they're just out on the ice to molt. It's my understanding that they're a lot more tolerant of each other at that time, and both the males and the females, and they'll congregate much closer. When we catch them, they're usually a couple body lengths apart. What happens is that the females will haul out onto the ice. They'll give birth to their pup, and then they'll basically lay there nursing their pup for about 35 to 40 days is their nursing period. But during that time, they're also trying to encourage their pups to get in the water, teach them to swim a little bit. So it's not constantly just laying and drinking milk, but that is a large part of their day. But it makes it really easy for us to find them because they're dark colored animals against the white snow. Um, so when they're out there, like I said, they're usually a couple body lengths apart. Sometimes the females will get aggressive towards other females, but not too much. And then the males are a little bit different. What they're doing at this time is they're going under the water, establishing an underwater territory, and fighting off competitors so that when the females are done nursing their pups, they go in the water and they see these display areas by the males, and so they can choose who they want to breed with based on whatever looks good to them. Clearly the ones who are winning the fights and able to maintain territory, but there are periods of time when it doesn't matter if a male is very successful at holding his territory or if he couldn't even get to that point. We do see all of them pretty much on top of the ice at some point. They do have to take some kind of break, just because that's so energetically demanding. And so usually they're also a little bit spread out, but every now and then they'll be more clumped together. Perhaps it's the ones who are just totally out of the running and maybe they're consolidating each other.
All right. They look very friendly, and like some of the pictures you sent, they're super adorable and very cute. How do they react to you guys coming up to them?
Yeah, the pups usually are very playful, kind of like the pictures would allow you to think. The mothers are really variable in how they perceive us. I think a lot of ones that it's kind of like maybe their third or fourth pup and they're used to it. It's just like, all right, weirdos in your red jackets, take my pup for a few minutes. I know you'll give it back. Fine, whatever. Um, a lot of the newer moms aren't sure what's going on. I mean, we basically come in and we move their pup away from the mother by a few feet. So if you think about having um, having a developing offspring inside of you for the better part of a year. You've finally given birth to it. You're about to give it a whole bunch of milk that you've spent a long time producing. And now suddenly someone has taken that offspring away from you. Yeah, you're probably going to be a little nervous. But um, they're usually pretty tolerant of us, and that's why we have somebody dedicated to watching the surrounding seals. Usually, they're also very focused on the mother, unless we have to retag an adult or an immigrant adult that never had tags on it. But most of our tagging efforts are on pups, and so that one person is watching the mother, and the mothers, like I said, they're variable in their behavior. But if we have more aggressive ones, they're just distracting it, trying to get them to not look at the pup because that's only going to stress them out more. And so, just kind of waving our hands. We have flags that we carry with us, and so that way we can, use that to wave in front of their face, and they get distracted by that. Every now and then they will try to attack us. They are awesome and graceful in the water. They are just awkward and weird on the ice, and so it's very obvious when they're trying to, they almost wind up before they try and bite. So it's really easy to avoid.
I'm like picturing this now. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So good to know. One of the questions was, have you or anybody on the research team down there ever been bit by them? I'm sure freak accidents happen all the time, but from what it sounds like, it's easy to avoid.
Luckily I didn't have to ever experience that, and I have never seen that happen. I think over the course of 50 years, there might have been, fewer than what I can count on my hand of circumstances where it was either a seal had maybe rolled over onto somebody and they're really heavy, so that could cause injury. And then I think at some point one person might have gotten a little bite, but it was through the boot, so it might have missed their skin. But yeah, we take a lot of care in recognizing those hazards and preparing for them and having protocols in place.
So you said that you weigh them, the
Mm-hmm.
mother, I assume. And I saw you like taking photos, and there's a picture with like the little PVC poles. Can
Mm-hmm.
you go through the process of how all that works?
Yeah, of course. So that's part of our mass study project. One of our students in our lab, she was a master's student, and her master's project looked at this, and now she has started her PhD, and her PhD project, I think, is looking at a lot of the mass parameters as well. But basically, her first project was looking to see, okay, we have these female mothers, and they're losing a ton of mass over the course of 35 to 40 days to help their pups grow. What is that transmission level? So, the idea is that it's probably not a perfect 100% all of the energy from the mother gets into the pup, but, how good is it and how might that change with how old and how heavy the mother is? And so they found, I guess I'll tell you the results and then I'll tell you the process. What they found is that the mothers that were rather heavy were able to put proportionately more into their pups, versus versus the lighter mothers. But age didn't play as strong of a role. The older ones, it seemed like they were giving a greater proportion of their body mass into their pups, but usually they were lighter. So it was kind of like they were trying really hard, but they just weren't as good as some of the younger mothers. So kind of your really young mothers weren't as good, your middle ones were really good, and then your older ones not as much. But if you're heavy, you're doing really well. And we can observe just how much they've lost over the course of a season, because at the beginning of the season they're super roly-poly. They're just absolutely rotund. And the females are a good bit larger than the males at this point. They're always some degree larger, but when they're just starting to nurse their pups, they're huge. And then by the end of the season, they've lost just a substantial amount of weight, and you can actually see their hip bones, and they look like completely different animals. And so the way that we weigh them, the pups are easy because they're small. So we have these specialized weighing bags that we can put them in, and it has a little breathing hole for them, and it has it's dark for them, so it's not as stressful. And so we can put the pups in these bags, and we have different sizes for when they get older and they get larger. And so we use just a normal scale. So we'll hang the bag from the scale. We basically do a squat, or the second half of a squat, to push them up off the ground. And then the scale will read how much they weigh. So that's simple and very direct. The mothers are much more difficult because they're so large. We have this weigh sled that works just like the scales at a veterinary office for dogs. But it's really difficult to get them onto this sled. So we have to kind of lure them onto the sled and then try to read the number and then get something. Hopefully it'll stabilize before they're off the sled. So it works, but it's rather difficult and cumbersome. And so what we have now started to do, I think they started in 2002 with this other method. It's called photogrammetry. And so you take those poles, as you mentioned, they're different colored. And so you can match those up. I think we put about 6 to 8 of them around the animal, and we have some of them sticking up vertically and some of them are laying on the ice or the snow horizontally. And we take a high picture, a medium picture, and a low picture at about 8 different angles around these seals. So all of your 4 corners and then the angles in between. And through all of these photographs, you can use a computer program to basically, it makes a model of the volume of the seal. And so with enough of those measured against the actual mass numbers from the weigh sled, this woman who was working on it, she made a regression line. And so from the photogrammetry, now you can say, all right, a seal that is this volume is generally going to be this mass in this level of precision. So it's a really cool process, and it's much easier for the researchers and the seals to just go take pictures. So
yeah, seems a little bit like less invasive. And it's funny because the thing, I guess, that kind of got the page on to talking about Antarctica was their discovery of the deepest point under the earth. But when I was reading about it, they were talking about how they kind of extrapolated how much ice was in Antarctica, and it sounds almost kind of like they did like a volume measurement of the ice. And yeah,
oh,
anyway,
cool.
it's fascinating. So let's see. So I've got one more question for me, and while we've been talking, somebody actually wrote in another question. So
Okay.
I guess this one's more of like a day in the life. What happens in case of a medical emergency? I've also heard that they have to click into guide rails when you guys are walking in between buildings. Is that true, or
I've not
maybe not?
experienced that. Maybe in other years. But so I guess a day in the life is the easier question, so I'm going to start with that one, and then we can kind of talk about emergencies that might come up. throughout that. So for our research team, we would start the morning getting a good breakfast. So getting enough calories throughout the day is really important because of how cold it is. And then the other thing that people don't always think about as easily is being well hydrated. So if you're more hydrated, your blood's moving better, and so it can actually carry the heat to your body, to different parts of your body, much better than if you don't have as if your blood is too thick because you don't have as much water in your system. So hydrating, eating, and then we get all of our gear together for the day. So that includes our tagging pliers, our weigh poles, our weigh bags, the scales, the little scales for the pups, um, and then the cameras and our field computers that we use to record the numbers, and then a set of tags. And so we usually we'll split into 2 or 3 groups so that we can cover more area of the habitat. And so the early season days, our main focus is just tagging newly born seals. In the latter part of the season, we're looking more for who's just there in general. So we'll have dedicated survey days where we'll cover the entire habitat in 1 to 2 days. And we just write down the tag numbers of every single seal that we see. All of this information goes into the field computer. And so as we're doing this, some of the dangers that we could potentially encounter would be, we kind of talked about the danger of the animal itself. If somebody was to get injured by an animal, the day would, be done. We'd get that person back to the station. There is a doctor on site. And so, generally that doctor would be able to patch that person up and they'd probably be back out the next day or maybe a couple of days. I don't think our team has ever had to send anybody home early. So that's good and hopefully continues. Yeah. But then some of the other dangers that we would face are, cold that we've talked about, but then also the study site it's not just pure flat ice. It can get different cracks and crevasses. So what happens every year is this ice builds up along the coast and it can extend out to varying distances each year, maybe 60 kilometers out from shore, maybe not as far, maybe only 40, just depends on the year. And then during the summertime, that ice doesn't melt, but it breaks out. So it breaks into smaller and smaller chunks, and then at some point it will melt. But that can break out completely or incompletely. And so if it's incomplete, you get ice from multi-years stacking up, and that can cause these divots or crevasses. Usually within our normal study site, we're not going to see those. But if we want to go back into some of the deeper areas closer to the shoreline, then we might get into some of these areas where there could be crevasses. And so, again, we never go alone. We go in teams of usually 3 people, at least 2. And we have these poles. They're metal poles, and they're, I don't know, maybe 6 feet long, much taller than me, is all I know. They have a flag at the end of it. And so the idea is you want to push down on the ice because a lot of it's covered in snow. You can't actually see it. So if you are constantly pushing down with your probing pole on the ice, you can tell if it's solid or if, oh, there's snow over here, but this is actually just, a deep crevasse here. There's no actual ice to stand on. So we use those to get around to certain areas of the habitat. And then the cracks are something that we look out for at the very beginning of the season, because usually they're going to form every year in a very similar place, but slightly different each year. And for some of the cracks, they might show up one year and not the next year. So we have to go out and make sure that we know where they are and how big they are. And as this season progresses and gets warmer, some of these cracks will expand out and open up. So we just have to monitor them. So similar to the crevasses, we can use those same probing poles and we can hit down on the ice and see, okay, this is a crack, but is it actual water underneath or is it still frozen? And so if it's still frozen, we can pass it, no problem. If not, we need to find where it gets smaller. And so the general rule is if the crack is thinner than 1/3 of your vehicle, you're fine to cross it. So yeah, so you have to
Feel a
really
little
kind of
nervous.
be, oh yeah, yeah, you just have to be on your game and very conscious the whole time you're there. But you have 5 to 7 other people with you, so it that makes it easier.
So this is like, I'm just like, oh, like imagining like being there and I've got like 5,000 other questions, but I think my phone is about to die on me, like completely full up in memory. So I'm gonna have to end this now, but thank you so much for talking with me. I find it absolutely fascinating. It's like pick your brain
Yeah.
all day.
Awesome. Well, if you have any more follow-up questions that you're just burning to know, feel free to email me, or if your followers want to follow up on this, feel free to send them my way either with email, or I think I gave you my Instagram. So either way would work.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks, you too.